Hey guys, welcome back to another Gaming Memories video. Here we are taking a look at the fourth video in the series of PS1 racing games only seen in Japan. And here we will be looking at another unique selection of games that are very unique and quite rare, that a lot of people probably don't even know about, that were only seen in Japan only. And we will also be taking a look into the unique aspects and features of the games, to see the differences between them and what made them so influential on the PlayStation. So before we take a look at the games on this list, leave a like on the video, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon to be updated whenever future videos are released, as more videos will be made to showcase other unique and quirky racing games that were released on the PlayStation 1 only in Japan. And also share the video with other like-minded gamers, as it does make a lot of these games a lot more known to other like-minded players. So let's dive in. Released in 1997, Racin is a game that is inspired by the Japanese Touring Car Championship that was very popular back in the 90s, where you actually have access to a dedicated championship with access to a load of mainstream and highly popular cars from different types of manufacturers within Japan itself, from the likes of Mitsubishi, Nissan, Mazda, Honda and so forth. The game itself utilizes arcade style elements but is simulation focused. The game is actually quite similar to other games that were actually released on the system at that time period, even similar to the likes of the Toka Racing series that was released in Europe, as a lot of these games do have very similar gameplay aesthetics. The game itself, although is very good to play, it's not without its challenges. The game is actually difficult to a point that it does take quite a bit to actually master. A lot of the different cars that you have access to have their own unique characteristics and handling physics, and each one will determine how the playthroughs actually work out as you're going through the game. Depending on which car you pick will actually depend on whether you can actually win races a lot easier or not. But if you're up for a challenge and you want to play something that actually is focused on the Touring Car Championship but also has arcade elements, Racin might be a suitable game that would be worth looking into. The PlayStation saw a varying mix of different types of arcade racers, and Deadheat Road is no exception. Released in Japan only in 1996, Deadheat Road is an arcade racer that is very similar to other well-known games released in that region, and it is also based off racing through the streets and highways of Tokyo in Japan. The game itself is quite rare, and a lot of people may not even know that this game even exists, and it uses a very similar format to the likes of the Ridge Racer series and other arcade games, as I've mentioned, to a point where you do have a selection of cars available, but you have access to a limit of 3 tracks, all with their own difficulty levels. So depending on the track that you choose will determine the overall difficulty of the gameplay. Although not as well refined as some other racers on the system, Deadheat Road does present a varying and adequate challenge, where it can be at times quite difficult to master. The controls can be a little bit on the twitchy side, and even with the track layouts it can be quite difficult to master the cornering and handling physics of the cars in question, so it can be quite difficult to win races overall. So primarily throughout the races you start off in a nighttime scene. As you gradually go through the laps and the races, you gradually witness the darkness turn to daylight towards the end of each race, and as you're racing on the highways you have to defeat other rival opponents on track, but you also do have to overcome varying amounts of traffic, from lorries to buses to other cars and taxis that can also get in the way to hamper your progress, so it does add to the challenge of the overall experience. Not the most well refined or polished game compared to other similar racers on the system, it is still worth a playthrough if you are into arcade style racers. And again, with it being a Japan only release, as there are so many of these types of games that were released in that region, it is a good opportunity to explore a very unique and rare game that is quite unheard of. So if you're looking for a different style of racer with an arcade feel, and you do like arcade racing games, then Deadheat Road is also another game that is worth looking into. Choro Q Wonderful is the fourth entry in the series of very popular and cartoony style racers that mainly was only seen in Japan. This, along with the previous two outings, only saw a release in Japan only also. And this game follows on a lot of the similar aesthetics, but there are quite a number of differences in this game, as the game itself graphically is overhauled compared to the original three games. This game does have similar aesthetics, but the graphics aren't as cartoony as the previous three titles. There's quite a bit more detail in the environments and even in the vehicles themselves compared to the previous three games in the series. But not only that, this game, unlike the others, is also the first game in the series to utilise off-road style elements also. So you have a mix of track racing with your standard cars, but you do have access to off-road vehicles likes of jeeps and trucks that you can utilise in different areas to jump over different hurdles and to go over types of terrain that you can't go over with your standard cars. But not only that, this game as well, on certain tracks you also have access to hidden areas and shortcuts if you can find them, that can give you a higher advantage throughout play. So if you're finding yourself behind the pack, you can use these shortcuts to be able to gain further up the rankings and potentially win races. So there's definitely a lot more elements added to this game. It's a generally bigger game overall compared to its previous three games. There's a lot more game modes and a lot more elements that are on offer here, but it still carries the same unique and quirky elements that were very popular in the original three games. But even the handling characteristics to a point have been gradually improved also. The cars no longer just go into random drifts and spin out as much as they used to in the previous games. Although you do have limitations on the braking, when you do use it you can slide off, and sometimes it's very hard to maintain the car's control around corners and so forth, so that you don't hit a wall, so that you don't lose your speed and so forth. So there are a lot of drastic improvements in a lot of areas in the game, and it is worthwhile checking out, especially if you're familiar with the series and you want to experience something a little bit different with the off-road elements and hidden locations that you can explore throughout each of the tracks. Choro Q Wonderful is also another game worth checking out. Released in 1996, Drivin A Go Go is a very unique and quirky early style racing game. Even though there were plenty of racers on the PlayStation at this time, this game is a port of an old Atari game from the same name, Drivin, and it was also a sequel to an original game that was released back in 1990 known as Drivin, which essentially it was one of the first 3D racing simulators to ever be created on the likes of computers, PCs and so forth. So looking at the graphics in this game, this is pretty much an early representation of how racing games or driving games looked back in the late 80s or early 90s, when they were really trying to utilise 3D graphics. The game itself has its own selection of unique tracks and cars to choose from, but it also does give you access to different game modes where you can go back and check out some of the original tracks from the original game that was released way back in the early 90s. And unlike other types of racing games, it does have racing elements, but it is more of a simulation game with loads of arcade elements thrown into the mix, where you can drive around different kind of like stunt based areas with loads of unique elements that make it quite difficult to master the car and to really get used to the tracks in general, as any one wrong move will lead you to instant doom, where the car will fall off the track or off a jump and explode at any given point. So you definitely have to have your wits about you and be willing to put in plenty of practice to get the most out of this game. So when you look at the graphics in the environments of the game itself, when you compare them to the other version of the game that's also available, as I mentioned, where you can see the differences in the graphics. In the older style, that was more of the representation of graphics back in the early days, but they added a bit more detail in terms of textures and so forth with the levels from this version of the game. Now the game isn't without its flaws. Again, it's more of a simulation game, but it does have arcade elements. But from having played it, it is quite unique, and even regardless of the flaws, it is quite fun to play. You will have a bit of a laugh with it, but again, it can get quite repetitive when you keep crashing the whole time, because it is a very, very difficult game to master. But not only that, this game, as it was only released in the Japan region, it is very, very rare and highly sought after. And currently at the moment, to get physical copies of this game will definitely cost you in the hundreds to be able to get access to it. Now if you're a collector, this is something that probably is worth having in your collection if you can afford it, but it may not be for everybody, as it is very, very expensive to get your hands on it. But if you are looking for something that is definitely different and you'd like to get a taste of what early racing games or even simulation games would have looked like back in the days even before the PlayStation, then Drivin A Go Go will be one of those unique games that is worth checking out. GT Kai was released in 1996 for the PlayStation in Japan only, and is the first in a series of racing games that focuses on the All Japan Touring Car Championship. There was a sequel that followed, but this game differs in terms of graphics and the visual representation of the game, as the sequel focuses on 3D graphics, whereas this game primarily focuses on 2D isometric style graphics, where it uses 2D sprites from an isometric perspective. It's a very similar style of game that you would have probably seen on the likes of 16-bit consoles, so it was quite different to see something like this on the PlayStation at that time, when you seen so many other racers that were using 3D graphics. The game itself offers up a unique mix of gameplay and various different elements where you can alter the physics and handling aspects of your car through the options menus inside of the game, so that you can tweak the controls to your own liking. And even though the gameplay is fast and frantic, it does present a very difficult challenge, as it isn't an easy game to pick up and play for the most part, as even with the controls, even with all of the dynamics and all the options that you have available, it's still very, very difficult to master the control system of each of the vehicles, as the handling can be quite twitchy or sometimes completely unresponsive, to a point that it can lead you to finding it very, very difficult to gain any sort of position or even win races. It's just one of those games that you would have to sit with it for a while to be able to get better at it, just with practice, if you can overcome a lot of the small glitches and flaws. But at the same time, offers up enough for racing fans alike, and if you're into these type of games, this is something that is quite unique and is very different, because there's not too many of these style of games on the PlayStation. Even with the plethora of racing games available, there's very few, if any, that actually look like this, so it would be worth checking out. Released in Japan only back in 1996, C1 Circuit is actually a budget titled racing game that was released on the PlayStation back at that time, and it can definitely be seen from the likes of the visual aesthetics of the game, and even in terms of some of the game mechanics and so forth. The game doesn't have the same development cycle compared to the likes of some other mainstream games, even some of the other games that's in this video, but the game does hold its own in terms of its playability. The game does have its own flaws and issues, and with it being a budget title, it's definitely reflective of it as you play it. But it's one of those type of games, the more that you actually dive into it and the more you actually put effort into it, you actually will have an enjoyable experience. Again, it takes a while to get used to the familiarity with the controls and the physics and so forth, but if you stick with it, there's actually quite a good game here. And if you're a fan of these type of racing games where you actually race at night, and even that are based around the likes of Japanese style kind of like motorways and highways, this is something that actually might be worth looking into. And again, with so many other titles out there that were released in Japan on the PlayStation, this is also another one that is worth checking out. The real Racin Toyota was published under the Simple 1500 budget series in Japan in 2000, and this is an arcade slash simulation focused racer that focuses around racing on tracks and championships, but primarily focusing on the Toyota brand only, where you have access to different types of cars from the likes of the Toyota Celica GT4, Toyota Soro, Toyota Chaser, Toyota Supra, and all the iconic classic JDM sports cars from Toyota from the 90s and early 2000s. If you have played this game, you will notice a lot of similarities, as the game uses the same engine and the same elements from another game released in Japan, also by the same developer by the name of Advan Racing. Essentially what this game is, it's the scaled down version of Advan Racing. As in that other game, you have access to a load of other brands and manufacturers of cars, even European cars, but in this game you only have access to Toyota based cars. Pretty much everything in the game is identical. When you compare the two of them together, there is no real differences in terms of the graphics and the features. The only difference is the selection of cars that are available within the game. The gameplay is quite good. It's fast, it has decent graphics, and the control system is easy enough to pick up and play, and it is a good all-round racer, and it was a good game to be added into that budget series. So if you're a fan of the Toyota brand, and also if you're a fan of the PlayStation, and you're looking for a unique mix that combines the two, then the real Racin Toyota may be worth a look at. Shutoku Battle R is another street racing inspired racing game that was released only in Japan for the PlayStation back in 1997, and the game primarily focuses on street racing around the city streets and highways of Tokyo, Japan, and the gameplay elements are very similar to other racers of that time, mainly the likes of Tokyo Highway Battle, the Option Tuning Car series, among other types of racers that were released on the system back in the 90s. You have access to a number of different tracks, all with their own unique style and elements. The tracks are quite wide to race on, and you have different game modes where you can try out practice modes and even time trials to be able to race the tracks on your own with no traffic, or you go through the scenario mode where you have to avoid oncoming traffic and so forth to defeat your opponents within the races. Although the game has a good aesthetic to it, it's not without its flaws, as the gameplay, although it does work quite well, the control system wouldn't be as responsive compared to other similar games that were released on the system. Plus, one major issue with the game is the sense of speed in the game. Even though you have access to a lot of iconic Japanese cars from that time, likes of the Subaru Impreza, Toyota Supra, Mitsubishi Lancer Evo 4, but you never really get a full sense of speed from the gameplay. You just never seem to get that sense of speed that you would get from other games on the system, but at the same time has enough unique features about it that does make it appealing to fans of street racing and this type of arcade racer that was based on the Japanese region, so it is worth checking out. Our Truck Battle 2 is the second game in the series that was released in 1999, and like the first game, was exclusive only to Japan. The game follows on the same premise of the original title, where you race as trucks on highways under the unique Dekotora team, where users customize their trucks very similar to what they do with the likes of the racing or car culture in Japan, where they modify their vehicles with different parts, visual aesthetics, and upgrade the power outputs of the vehicles in question so that they can compete in different events and even just showcase them at different types of events and so forth. So the gameplay in this game is very similar to that of the first, where you are racing on different highways and you have to compete against opponents on the track, where you have to get from one end of the destination to the other, and you need to defeat the opponent in the race in order to win currency to upgrade your trucks, to buy better parts and so forth. You also do have access to different features that weren't available in the first game, even with a unique graphic editor where you can create your own visual graphics that you can use for painting onto your trucks once you start to upgrade them in the game, which is quite a unique feature, so you can add your own visual style. Again, the gameplay is very linear like the first game, and there's very little difference in the overall look and feel of the gameplay and the style. But like the first game, if you are looking for something a little bit different that was only exclusive to Japan and with a unique take on racing games that you would only see in that region, this is another one of those games that may be worth checking out. Rally de Europe is another unique arcade style racing game that was released in 2000, and it is also the sequel to Rally de Africa, which also only saw a release in Japan for the PlayStation. And like its predecessor, the gameplay and visuals take a heavy influence from that of Sega Rally, and the game continues on with the formula that was very popular in the first game, but enhances some of the visual elements and control physics of each of the vehicles, while adding in different locations around Europe, anywhere from the likes of Italy to Wales and other locations in the game. With the gameplay, visuals also comes across with longer and more intricate tracks to race on, although a lot more difficult to master, as a lot of the tracks in the game aren't as wide compared to that was in the first game. The tracks are a lot narrower, and as a result can present a lot more of a unique challenge. The gameplay overall is a lot more difficult than its predecessor, and in a lot of ways didn't get as good a reception overall compared to the first game in the series. But that doesn't take away from the unique elements within the game, as it has enough about it to warrant a playthrough. And if you're a fan of Sega Rally, this is another really unique game that is worth trying out, as it has a lot of the similar characteristics even with that of the first game, as again they're heavily influenced by that ever popular arcade racer. And if you are looking for something that has unique elements that are familiar with those type of games, then this series of games is definitely worth trying out. Kattobi Tune is another unique arcade style racing game that was released in Japan only in 1998. And this game focuses a lot on racing with the likes of tuner cars, as it focuses on the tuner type culture back at that time. So you race around a number of different race tracks all within the Japanese region, and you have cars exclusive to different brands, anything from the likes of Nissan to Toyota, Mazda, where you can drive cars the likes of the Nissan Silvia S14, Toyota Supra, different variations of the Nissan R33 Skyline GTR, even as far as EK Civics, Mazda RX-7, and even the Mazda Miata or MX-5. So you have a number of different game modes available, where you can start off with the championship mode or go into the likes of versus or even practice mode, where you can gain access to a lot of the cars in the game straight from the get-go and start playing around with it to get a feel for how the cars feel as you go through each of the races. The handling physics in the game compared to other racers are really quite good, as it does handle and feel very well on the tracks. Compared to a lot of other racing games that were released in Japan, this is definitely one of the better ones to play in that respect. And with enough information and content available, especially if you're a car fan, as you can start off with standard versions of the cars available, and as you progress you can upgrade the cars with different types of body kits, suspension parts, engine parts to increase the power outputs, etc. of all of the vehicles to give yourself more of an advantage as you go through each of the races. So there's definitely a lot here to keep fans of racing cars playing for a long time, and this is definitely one of those games that was only seen in Japan that is really worth a look at. So here we have taken another unique look at a selection of PS1 racing games only seen in Japan, where we have looked at a lot of the unique features and characteristics of each of the games, along with the pros and cons of what made them so quirky, rare and a lot of fun. But I'd love to know your thoughts on each of the games on this list. Did you know that any of these games even existed, and if so, have you played them? I'd love to hear your stories, so be sure to share them down in the comments below. And if you have enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more of these type of videos where I do share videos of other unique type racing games that were only seen in Japan, then be sure to leave a like on the video, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon to be updated when future videos are released. Also be sure to share the video with other like-minded gamers, as it does allow for a lot of these games to be seen by other players that may not even have known they existed. Be sure to check out some of the other videos in the series where we do look over a lot of other rare type PS1 racing games only seen in Japan. So be sure to go and check those videos out, and until next time, make sure to keep playing those classic games and enjoying them, and keep those gaming memories alive.